She had always known that marriage wasn't going to be easy, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of living with a husband who seemed to care more about his mother than about her. From the moment they got married, it felt as though she was just another piece in a puzzle, never fully fitting in, always struggling to find her place. Her husband, though kind in his own way, always found himself caught between her and his mother. It wasn't that he didn't love her, but his loyalty to his mother was unshakable. At first, she thought it was just a phase. Maybe his mother was just trying to get used to the idea of a new woman in her son's life. But as time went on, things didn't change. If anything, they grew worse. Her mother-in-law seemed to have an opinion on everything. How she cooked, how she cleaned, even how she spoke. Nothing she did was ever good enough. The constant criticisms, often disguised as helpful advice, weighed on her day by day. It wasn't just her mother-in-law. Her husband, too, seemed to turn a blind eye to the hurtful comments his mother made. She had hoped he would step in, stand up for her, but instead, he brushed off her concerns, saying things like, "She's just trying to help," or "You know how she is." Each time he made excuses for her mother, it felt like another small piece of her dignity was chipped away. It didn't help that her mother-in-law was always present in their lives. She would call almost every day, stopping by unannounced, offering unsolicited advice on everything from the food they ate to the way they managed their finances. The woman often felt like a guest in her own home, walking on eggshells, always careful not to upset anyone. Her every move was scrutinized by the very people who should have been her support system. It was exhausting. But the worst part wasn't the constant criticism. It was the way her husband seemed to agree with his mother without question. There were nights when she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, asking herself why she had ever agreed to this marriage. She had never imagined it would be this way. She thought she would find love and understanding, not the endless cycle of being told she wasn't good enough. Even on the rare occasions when she tried to voice her frustrations, her husband dismissed her feelings. "You're overreacting," he would say. "My mom doesn't mean any harm." But to her, it felt like more than harmless remarks. It felt like a continuous assault on her self-worth, and no matter how hard she tried to be patient, she was reaching her breaking point. One afternoon, after another stinging comment from her mother-in-law about her cooking, something inside her snapped. She had tried for so long to make the best of things, to stay calm and patient, but this time was different. Her heart ached, and yet a fire burned inside her. This wasn't how she was meant to live. This wasn't the life she imagined. She realized that if things were ever going to change, it had to come from her. No one else was going to stand up for her. No one else was going to fight for her happiness. And so, with a heavy heart and a determined mind, she decided that it was time for a change. She would no longer allow herself to be made to feel small. Whatever happened next, she would make sure it was on her terms. This part is designed to draw the audience into her emotional journey, highlighting her growing frustrations and the silent strength she carries. The day that changed everything started like any other. She was at home, preparing lunch, trying to keep busy while her husband worked, and her mother-in-law made her usual phone calls. But today felt different. There was an unease in the air, a quiet tension that seemed to grow with each passing minute. She could feel it building inside her, a frustration she had been carrying for so long. But today, it felt heavier than ever before. She had had enough. As she stirred the pot, her mother-in-law arrived, uninvited, as usual. She walked in with her usual loud cheer, her presence filling the room like a storm. Her mother-in-law barely acknowledged her, immediately launching into a conversation with her son about work, ignoring the fact that lunch was almost ready. The woman had always acted as if her son didn't have a life outside of her. Every conversation seemed to revolve around her needs, her opinions, her wants, leaving no space for anyone else. But today, something snapped in the woman. She had been patient, too patient for too long, but the constant disrespect had drained her. She had tried to play the role of the perfect wife, always staying quiet and avoiding confrontation. But her silence had only allowed the situation to continue. Her heart raced, and she could feel the familiar ache of frustration. But this time, there was something else, something stronger. It was anger, not just at her mother-in-law's constant interference, but at her husband too. He had stood by, offering no protection, no support. Her mother-in-law's voice rang out again, this time commenting on the meal she had prepared. "You should have added more salt," she said, her tone cold and critical. Her words stung, but the woman was done pretending that it didn't bother her. The years of constant undermining were finally taking their toll. She couldn't stay silent anymore. This time, she wasn't going to let her mother-in-law's words pass without a response. "Actually," she said, keeping her voice steady, "I like it this way. It's fine the way it is." Her voice was calm, but inside, her emotions were a storm. She had finally spoken up. For the first time in a long while, she stood up for herself. Her mother-in-law looked taken aback for a moment, not used to being challenged. There was a brief silence, and then, as if trying to regain control, she muttered something about how she had always been the one to take care of things, implying that the woman didn't know what she was doing. It was the same old line, the same old pattern. And for once, she wasn't going to let it slide. She glanced at her husband, hoping for some support, but his eyes were focused on his phone. He hadn't even noticed the tension. He was still lost in his own world, as if everything was fine. His indifference stung more than his mother's words. He had always let his mother take the lead, never questioning her, never seeing how much it hurt his wife. The woman felt a mix of anger and disappointment. She had always tried to make things work, to keep the peace, but it seemed that no matter how hard she tried, it was never enough. This wasn't just about the salt or the meal. It was about respect, about feeling like she mattered. She had been patient, but now patience had turned to frustration. As she set the table, she made a quiet promise to herself. This was the moment things were going to change. She wasn't going to allow her husband or mother-in-law to push her around anymore. The days of silence and compromise were over. She had done nothing wrong, but she had allowed herself to be treated as if she had. No more. She would no longer let them make her feel small. Something inside her had shifted, and she could feel it. The woman was no longer the passive bystander in her own life. She had finally decided to take control, and nothing was going to stop her. This part further emphasizes the protagonist's internal conflict, her growing sense of frustration, and the moment when she decides she won't stay quiet anymore. It builds anticipation for the changes she's about to make. The decision had been made, but now, the hard part began. She knew that standing up for herself wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't enough to just speak her mind once and expect things to magically change. She had to be smart about it. There was more at stake now. Her dignity, her peace of mind, and her future. If she wanted things to be different, she needed a plan. For the first time in a long while, she focused on herself. She started taking small steps that would lead to bigger changes. At first, it wasn't anything dramatic, just subtle shifts in her daily life. She began taking better care of herself, mentally and physically. She woke up early to have some quiet time before the chaos of the day began. She read books, meditated, and took long walks by herself. She realized that by taking these moments for herself, she felt stronger, more centered. Slowly, her confidence began to grow. But this was only the beginning. She wasn't just working on herself. She was also quietly making changes in how she interacted with her husband and mother-in-law. The next time her mother-in-law made a remark about the way she did something, whether it was her cooking, cleaning, or anything else, she didn't react with the usual silence. She simply responded with calm authority, letting her mother-in-law know that she had it under control. She wasn't asking for approval anymore. She was standing her ground. And surprisingly, her mother-in-law didn't know how to handle it. Her husband was a different story. She knew he had always been distant, not because he didn't love her, but because he had never really been forced to think about how his actions, or lack of actions, affected her. The first few times she tried to assert herself, he didn't seem to notice. He was wrapped up in his own world, too caught up in his work and his mother's needs to realize how much she had been silently suffering. But that didn't stop her. She refused to let his indifference discourage her. She started making small changes at home, ones that took her focus away from them and redirected it to herself. She organized the house the way she wanted, bought new clothes that made her feel confident, and started thinking about her own future. The more she worked on herself, the less power her husband and mother-in-law's opinions had over her. She wasn't looking for their approval anymore. She was reclaiming control over her own life. She also began to look for ways to become financially independent. For so long, she had been dependent on her husband, but now she saw how important it was to have her own stability, her own strength. She started working on a side project that had always interested her. At first, it was just a hobby, something to take her mind off things. But as she put more time and effort into it, she realized that it had the potential to become something more. This was her chance to build something for herself, to create a future that wasn't tied to anyone else's expectations. With each passing day, she felt more empowered. She was becoming someone who could take care of herself, someone who wasn't afraid to stand up for her needs and desires. She wasn't just waiting for her husband or her mother-in-law to change. She was changing, and that was enough for now. She knew that soon they would start to notice the shift in her, the quiet confidence that had begun to replace the silence. This part focuses on the protagonist's quiet transformation. It's about the small yet impactful steps she takes to reclaim her power, building confidence and independence. It sets the stage for the changes that will eventually affect her relationship with her husband and mother-in-law. As the days went by, she could feel the changes in herself taking root. She wasn't the same woman she had been a few months ago, the one who quietly accepted the harsh words and the disrespect. Now she was determined to make sure her actions spoke louder than her silence ever had. The changes were subtle at first, but they were starting to show. One evening, her mother-in-law came over, as usual, without any prior notice. She walked into the house with her usual energy, as if she owned the place, immediately starting a conversation with her son. But this time, there was something different about the atmosphere. The woman had prepared dinner and had laid the table in a way that she knew her mother-in-law would notice. It was small, but it was a sign that she was no longer going to tolerate being overlooked. Her mother-in-law made the usual comment about the meal, questioning why certain ingredients were used or suggesting improvements. But instead of nodding and accepting the comments as she once had, she calmly replied, "I thought this would taste good. I like it this way." It wasn't a confrontation. It was simply an assertion of her own opinion. Her mother-in-law paused, clearly thrown off by her response. The woman could see the brief flicker of surprise in her eyes, but she didn't let it faze her. Her husband, who had been quiet up until now, noticed the shift. He was used to the old routine, where his mother's comments were accepted without question. He glanced at his wife, his expression unreadable, but for the first time in a long while, he seemed unsure. He didn't intervene, but he didn't dismiss her either. The silence between them grew thick, but she remained calm, knowing that her actions were speaking volumes. The next day, the same pattern continued. When her husband made a comment about something small, like how she had arranged the living room or what she planned to do that weekend, she no longer tried to please him with her answers. She spoke her mind, explaining what she thought and why she thought it. It wasn't about arguing. It was simply about being heard. For years, she had suppressed her own thoughts and desires in favor of others. But now she realized that she had just as much right to express herself as anyone else. Her husband seemed confused, unsure of how to react. This was not the woman he was used to. He had grown comfortable in the way things were, even if it meant ignoring the quiet tension in their marriage. But now that she was starting to assert herself, he didn't know how to handle it. He hadn't prepared for this version of his wife, the one who had decided to take charge of her own life, no longer relying on him or his mother for approval. Her mother-in-law, too, began to notice the shift. She was used to making demands and getting what she wanted. But now, when she made a comment or suggestion, the woman simply responded with confidence. If she didn't agree, she said so. If something was bothering her, she voiced it calmly. There was no longer room for her mother-in-law's constant interference. As these small changes continued to unfold, she could feel herself growing stronger. She didn't need anyone's permission to be herself, to have her own opinions, or to make decisions for her life. The more she practiced speaking her mind, the more natural it felt. She had learned that she didn't need to fight to be heard. She just had to speak with the same confidence that everyone else did. And in doing so, she began to see the shift in how others treated her. No longer did they dismiss her or make her feel invisible. She was becoming someone who couldn't be ignored. This part continues to highlight the protagonist's growing sense of self-assurance, focusing on her small but significant actions in asserting herself. It shows the gradual shift in her relationships, particularly with her husband and mother-in-law, and sets the stage for the more significant changes that will follow. You said, with each passing day, the woman could feel the power of her own transformation. She was no longer the quiet wife who tried to keep the peace at all costs. Slowly but surely, she had begun to carve out a space for herself, one where her voice was no longer silenced. It wasn't about making grand gestures. It was the small, consistent actions that were creating the change she had longed for. And what she didn't expect was how quickly everything was starting to fall into place. Her side project, which had started as just something to pass the time, was now taking shape. She had been working on it in the evenings, using the time when her husband was busy with work or out with his friends. She put in the effort, learning, planning, and slowly watching it grow. What had once felt like a hobby was becoming something more, something that could provide her with the independence and sense of accomplishment she had been craving. At first, the progress was slow, and doubt occasionally crept in. But she kept going. Each time she saw even the smallest sign of success, it fueled her determination. The more she worked on this project, the more she realized that it wasn't just about financial independence. It was about proving to herself that she could achieve something on her own without needing anyone's approval. Her confidence soared, and with it came a sense of self-worth that had been missing for far too long. But the real change came when her husband began to notice. At first, he hadn't really understood what she was doing. He'd seen her working on her project and asked the occasional question, but he hadn't shown much interest. He was caught up in his own routine, still wrapped in the comfort of his mother's constant influence. But when he saw the results, when he saw how far she had come, he couldn't ignore it anymore. One evening, after a long day at work, he came home to find her at the kitchen table, looking over some new plans for her project. This time, there was no ignoring it. He paused, looking at her with a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. She could see the change in his expression. He was starting to realize just how much she had changed. He asked her how things were going, and for the first time, she didn't downplay her achievements. She told him about her progress, about the plans she had for the future, and how she was feeling more confident than ever. He didn't know how to respond. For so long, he had been used to the quiet woman who never asked for more. He had never seen her like this, strong, independent, and unafraid to speak her mind. It was a shock, but it was also a wake-up call. His silence had been part of the problem. He had taken her for granted, assuming that she would always stay in the background. But now he could see that she had grown beyond that. Her mother-in-law, too, was starting to notice the change. She had always believed that she could control the household, that her son's life revolved around her opinions. But now, when she came over with her usual critical remarks, she was met with calm confidence. The woman no longer accepted the constant interference. If her mother-in-law said something about how she ran the house or what she should be doing, she simply responded, "I'm handling it, thanks." It wasn't disrespectful, but it was firm. It was clear that she wasn't going to allow anyone to undermine her anymore. And slowly, the respect she had always craved began to trickle in. People who once ignored her or belittled her now took notice of her quiet strength. She could feel it. This was just the beginning. The progress she had made in such a short amount of time was astonishing. She was no longer just reacting to the world around her. She was actively shaping it. And for the first time in a long while, she felt proud of who she was becoming. This part continues to build the protagonist's confidence and independence, showing the effects of her actions on her relationships. It emphasizes how her hard work and personal growth are starting to pay off and how those around her are beginning to notice the changes. As the weeks passed, the woman began to realize that the changes she had made were having a bigger impact than she had ever imagined. The seeds she had planted, her newfound confidence, her personal growth, and her independent efforts were now starting to bloom, and it was clear that things could never go back to the way they were. Her side project, which had once felt like a small escape, was now beginning to take on a life of its own. The small steps she had taken had turned into something much more substantial. She was no longer just dabbling in a hobby. She had turned her passion into a serious venture. People around her were noticing her success. Friends and even strangers began to reach out for advice, and soon she started receiving recognition for her hard work. What had started as a quiet rebellion against her situation had blossomed into something bigger than she could have imagined. She felt a sense of pride that she had never experienced before. But the real turning point came when she received her first major opportunity. An unexpected email arrived one evening offering her the chance to expand her project in ways she had only dreamed of. It was an offer that could change everything for her. And suddenly, all the hard work, late nights, and determination seemed to have paid off. The weight of this opportunity was overwhelming, but in that moment, she felt more alive than she ever had. This was the moment when she realized just how far she had come, and she knew that nothing could stand in her way now. Her husband noticed the change in her too. He had been watching her from the sidelines, unsure of what to make of her transformation. He had always taken her for granted, assuming she would always be there, quietly supporting him and his mother. But now he was seeing her in a new light. She wasn't the woman who had always put others first. She was someone with dreams and goals of her own. She was a force to be reckoned with, and it was clear that she wasn't going to settle for the life that had been handed to her. His feelings of uncertainty grew, and he began to feel like a stranger in his own home, unsure of how to act around her. He tried to engage with her more, asking about her project, but the conversations felt awkward. She had become someone who no longer needed his validation to feel confident. For so long, he had been her anchor, but now, she was the one holding the reins. It was a strange shift, and he didn't know how to respond. He had always been used to being the one who made decisions, the one who took charge, but now she was the one calling the shots. And though he could see the success she was achieving, he couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. He had never seen her like this before, and it made him question their entire relationship. As for her mother-in-law, her attitude shifted as well. She had always been a constant presence, a figure who had seemed untouchable, believing that her opinions mattered more than anyone else's. But now, when she came over with her usual remarks, she was met with a woman who no longer accepted the criticism. The woman politely but firmly told her that she was handling things just fine. It wasn't disrespect, but it was a clear boundary. She was no longer a passive participant in the game. She was setting the rules. Her mother-in-law didn't know how to react at first. She was used to dominating the household, making decisions for everyone. But now, she found herself faced with a woman who was no longer afraid to stand up for herself. There was a moment of silence whenever the two women interacted. Her mother-in-law, unsure of how to regain control, retreated into silence, but the woman knew that her stance had made an impact. She had established that she would no longer be silenced, no longer be treated as someone who existed solely to fulfill others' expectations. The change in her was becoming undeniable. She was no longer the woman who had stayed quiet in the background. She was now someone who commanded attention without saying a word. People took notice of her accomplishments, her confidence, and her strength. And in doing so, they also began to recognize her worth. She had proved to herself, and to everyone else, that she was more than capable of shaping her own destiny. This part focuses on the protagonist's growing success and the emotional shift in her relationships. It emphasizes how her determination and hard work are beginning to pay off, making a significant impact on her life and those around her. As the days turned into weeks, the woman began to realize just how much her life had changed. What once seemed like small steps of defiance had now grown into a complete transformation. Her side project, which she had once worked on quietly in her spare time, had blossomed into something much bigger. It was no longer just a hobby or a way to fill the empty hours. It had become a key part of her identity. She felt proud of what she had achieved, not because it was something others had told her to do, but because it was something she had built on her own terms. Her success didn't just come in the form of recognition or opportunities. It came in the quiet moments too. Those moments when she looked in the mirror and saw a woman who had taken control of her life. She was no longer the passive wife who had accepted everything without question. She had learned to trust her instincts, to speak her mind, and most importantly, to never allow anyone to dim her light. It was empowering, knowing that she had the strength to change her own future. But it wasn't just about the personal growth or the success she had found in her project. Her relationships were changing as well, and the most noticeable change was with her husband. The man who had once been so indifferent to her feelings was now noticing the shift. He had been watching from the sidelines, unsure of what to make of the new woman who was now in front of him. At first, he had felt uncomfortable with her confidence. It was as though the balance of their relationship had been thrown off. For so long, he had been the one who made the decisions, who held the power, but now she was the one taking charge. He tried to talk to her more, asking about her project and what she was working on. At first, these conversations were awkward, as if he didn't quite know how to engage with her. He had always been used to a wife who was quiet and agreeable, someone who would let him handle everything. But now, the tables had turned. She was no longer just waiting for him to make decisions for both of them. She was making her own choices, and he didn't know how to respond. One evening, he asked her how her project was going. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet confidence. She shared her excitement about the opportunity she had received and how it was starting to change things for her. She could see the mixture of pride and uncertainty on his face. He was proud of her, but at the same time, he felt like he was losing the grip he once had on their relationship. It was clear that this wasn't the woman he had married. She was someone stronger, someone who had found her own way, and wasn't afraid to walk down that path alone if needed. Her mother-in-law, too, had started to notice the change. At first, she had tried to maintain her usual control over the household, making her usual critical remarks and offering unsolicited advice. But now, when she spoke, the woman responded calmly, without defensiveness. She simply explained that things were fine as they were. She wasn't interested in fighting or making a scene, but she wasn't going to let her mother-in-law's words affect her anymore. Her mother-in-law didn't know how to handle it. For so long, she had been the one in charge, the one whose opinions were always valued. But now, there was a quiet force in the house that could not be ignored. It wasn't rude, and it wasn't disrespectful, but it was firm. Her mother-in-law started to retreat into silence, unsure of how to regain control, but the woman knew she had made her mark. It wasn't just her relationships with her husband and mother-in-law that were changing. She could feel the shift in how she carried herself. She walked with her head held higher, with the knowledge that she had earned her place in the world. She had worked hard for what she had achieved, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that away from her. This part continues to emphasize the protagonist's transformation, focusing on the growing impact of her success and self-confidence. It also explores the emotional shifts in her relationships, particularly with her husband and mother-in-law, as they begin to see the new woman she has become. The changes that had begun so quietly were now undeniable. The woman had created a life for herself that was completely different from what it had been just a few months ago. Looking back, she marveled at how far she had come. She wasn't the same person who had quietly accepted disrespect, who had stayed in the background while others took the spotlight. She had worked hard, not only to achieve success, but also to find her own voice, her own strength. As she reflected on her journey, she realized just how much her sense of self-worth had grown. She had never thought she would be the kind of person who could stand up for herself so confidently, but now she knew she could handle anything life threw her way. Her side project, which had started as a small escape, had become a thriving venture. She had worked tirelessly to make it a success, and now it was something she could be proud of. It had opened doors for her that she never thought possible. What started as a way to prove to herself that she was capable had turned into a career that filled her with purpose and pride. But it wasn't just the success she had gained that made her feel proud. It was the fact that she had done it on her own terms. She hadn't relied on anyone's approval or validation. She had pushed through doubt and uncertainty, and now she stood tall, knowing that the life she had built was one she could truly call her own. Her relationship with her husband had shifted too. At first, his confusion had been evident, unsure of how to navigate the changes in their marriage. But now, he seemed to have come to terms with the new dynamic. He had started to treat her differently, with more respect, more understanding. He didn't always know how to keep up with her newfound independence, but he was learning. They were still figuring things out, but one thing was clear. She was no longer the woman who would quietly accept a life of silence and compromise. She had learned to voice her needs and desires, and she wasn't afraid to pursue them, with or without his support. Her mother-in-law, too, had started to change. At first, she had resisted the shift, unsure of how to handle the woman who no longer accepted her constant interference. But now, she seemed to respect her more. There were still moments of tension, but they had become less frequent. The woman had learned to set boundaries without being confrontational. She had found a way to maintain her own sense of self while still being part of the family. It wasn't always easy, but she knew she had earned that respect, and she wasn't about to lose it. The woman had also found peace within herself. For so long, she had lived with the nagging feeling that she wasn't good enough, that she didn't measure up to the expectations others had placed on her. But now, she had let go of those insecurities. She knew her worth. She knew what she was capable of. And most importantly, she knew that she didn't need anyone's approval to feel confident and fulfilled. She had discovered a strength within herself that she never knew existed. She had risen above the challenges, the doubts, and the criticism. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every moment. And as she looked ahead to the future, she knew that she was ready for whatever came next. No longer would she be the woman who silently accepted life as it came. She was the woman who made her own choices, who created her own path, and who never settled for anything less than what she deserved. This part wraps up the protagonist's journey of growth and empowerment, highlighting the transformation she has gone through. It emphasizes her newfound strength, her success, and her ability to take control of her life. The conclusion reinforces the idea that she has become a confident, self-assured woman who has reclaimed her voice and her worth.